The transition from unconsciousness is not peaceful, it is agonizing. Grace doesn't just wake up, he surfaces through a haze of profound physical weakness and neurological static. His first sensation is an overwhelming full-body soreness, compounded by the blinding glare of sterile, white LED lights. He is lying on a soft, contoured bed, entirely naked, and tethered to a nightmare of medical tubing. A catheter violates his bladder, N4 pierces his arm, and a feeding tube snakes down his throat. Before he can even process the panic of his physical state, a multi-jointed robotic arm descends from the ceiling. A computerized voice demands cognitive proof of life. What is 2 plus 2? His brain feels wrapped in cotton. It takes monumental effort just to mentally grasp the concept of numbers, let alone articulate the word 4 when he finally manages to croak out the answer. The robotic nurse registers his cognitive function and begins the excruciating process of removing his tubes. As the immediate physical pain of the tube removal subsides, a deeper psychological horror sets in. He has no idea who he is. His mind is a complete blank. He doesn't know his name, his profession, his home, or his past. He possesses a strange array of semantic knowledge. He understands physics. He knows what a computer is, and he can do math, but his episodic memory is completely wiped. He is a ghost, trapped in his own severely atrophied body, possessing intellect but entirely devoid of identity. As he attempts to move, his muscles tremble with the exhaustion of long-term disuse. He realizes his body is heavily atrophied, hinting that he has been asleep for a very, very long time. Compounding his disorientation is the environment itself. He isn't just in a high-tech medical bay, he is floating. The lack of gravity confirms he is no longer on Earth, but the environment around him offers no clues. It is a strictly utilitarian room built for survival rather than comfort. Driven by a primal need to understand his surroundings, he pushes himself away from his own bed, only other features. 2 identical hibernation pods adjacent to his own, he peers into the first pod, hoping for answers, a colleague, or a friend. Instead, he finds a corpse. The body of a woman lies in the bed, her skin pulled tight over her skull, completely desiccated. She hasn't just died recently, she has been dead long enough for the automated systems to completely dehydrate her remains. Fighting back nausea and rising panic, he propels himself to the third bed. Inside is a man, sharing the exact same fate, a mummified busk frozen in a silent scream of long-forgotten decay. The terrifying reality solidifies in his fractured mind. He is millions of miles from a home he cannot remember, drifting in the silent vacuum of space, and he is the sole survivor of a mission he doesn't understand. The waking process was less of a birth and more of a brutal extraction. Grace's first conscious experiences were defined by the cold, sterile tyranny of the ship's automated medical bay. The robotic arms that hovered over his bed, designed to be life-saving caretakers, felt terrifyingly alien. His early attempts to assert control ended in agonizing failure. When he instinctively reached up to pull a feeding tube from his throat, a mechanical appendage clamped down on his wrist with terrifying hydraulic strength, pinning him back against the mattress. The ship's AI didn't understand fear or comfort. It only understood its programming to keep his vitals stable. He was forced into a horrifying game of trial and error. If I move my leg too fast, the restraints engage. If I try to speak before the hydration cycle is complete, the machine administers a mild sedative. Slowly, he learned to communicate with the system through compliant compliance. He performed the basic motor function tests, tracked the blinding pen lights with his eyes, and swallowed the nutrient slurries without fighting. Only then did the machines begin to peel back the tubes and wires, granting him a terrifying sliver of autonomy, even as his body began to obey his commands. His mind remained trapped in a suffocating gray fog. He possessed immense banks of knowledge. He knew what a Newton was, he understood orbital mechanics, and he knew the chemical composition of the sedative the machine had pumped into him. But he didn't know who was possessing this information. The breakthrough came unceremoniously. As the central computer prompted him for voice authorization to unlock the medical restraints, he stared at a blank screen. The machine repeated its sterile demand. The pressure in his skull pounded, a migraine born of deep sleep amnesia. Then a fragment broke loose, a memory of a classroom, a nameplate on a desk. "Grace," he croaked, his vocal cords raw and unused. The computer chirped in acknowledgement. Ryland Grace. The name settled over him, heavy and real. He had an identity. He was a person, a scientist, a man with a past. But the comfort of regaining his name was immediately overshadowed by the terrifying question of his present. Freed from the medical bed, Grace stumbled on atrophied legs, his bare feet slapping against the cold metal deck. The air was thick and smelled of ozone and recycled oxygen. He moved through the dimly lit medical bay, expecting to find a crew. Instead, he found the other stasis pods. The first pod held a man. The second, a woman. They had not been spared the ravages of a system failure. Their flesh was desiccated, their features sunken and unrecognizable, preserved in a macabre state of mummification. The automated medical systems that had violently kept Grace alive had failed his companions. A cold sweat broke out across his skin as the silence of the ship pressed in on him. He dragged himself to the nearest viewport, desperately hoping to see the familiar blue and green marble of Earth. He hit the manual override for the blast shield. The heavy metal shutters retracted, revealing the void. But the stars were wrong. They were too bright, too dense, and completely unfamiliar. The constellations he knew had been wiped away, replaced by an alien tapestry of blinding white light and infinite, suffocating darkness. There was no mission control on the radio. There was no captain. There was only Ryland Grace, a graveyard of a ship, and millions of miles of empty space. He was entirely, inescapably alone. Aboard the desolate, sterile environment of the Hail Mary, a simple sensory input, a smell, a specific word, or a piece of equipment acts as a catalyst for Grace's amnesiac brain. The fog temporarily lifts, plunging him back to Earth. He remembers that before he woke up on a spaceship millions of miles from home. He wasn't an astronaut at all. He was Mr. Grace, a beloved junior high school science teacher. But his path to the classroom was paved by professional exile. Before teaching, Dr. Ryland Grace was a promising, albeit controversial, molecular biologist. His academic career came to a screeching halt when he published a paper arguing that the scientific community's definition of life was too narrow. He hypothesized that life did not inherently require water to exist, the stance that challenged a fundamental pillar of terrestrial biology. Ridiculed and effectively shunned by his peers, Grace left academia in disgrace. He found solace in teaching children, abandoning high-level research entirely. However, the very theory that destroyed his career is exactly what makes him the most crucial biologist on the planet. Grace's memories reveal the arrival of Eva, the formidable and legally untouchable leader of a special task force. Strat pulls Grace directly out of his classroom because a global crisis of unprecedented proportions is unfolding. Astronomers, spearheaded by a scientist named Irina Petro, have discovered an anomaly, an invisible arc of energy stretching from the Sun to Venus. This phenomenon, dubbed the Petrova line, coincides with a terrifying reality: the Sun's luminous output is steadily decreasing. If the dimming continues at its current rate, Earth will be plunged into a catastrophic, planet-killing ice age in less than 30 years. Drafted into Strat's clandestine scientific coalition, Grace is tasked with examining a sample captured from Petrova line using a highly secure makeshift laboratory. He makes a series of staggering discoveries about the nature of the threat. He realizes the arc isn't a beam of energy. It's a migration path for a microscopic, single-celled alien organism. Grace names it astrophage, Greek for star eater. Through his experiments, Grace uncovers the terrifying biological profile of the microbe. It can survive in the vacuum of space and withstand the literal surface temperature of the Sun, validating Grace's disgraced theory. Astrophage contains no water, functioning on an entirely different biological paradigm. The microbe absorbs electromagnetic radiation from the Sun, storing it by converting it perfectly into mass. It then uses this stored energy to travel between the Sun for fuel and Venus for carbon dioxide to reproduce. It reproduces at an alarming exponential rate. The more astrophage there is, the faster the Sun dims. The memory solidifies the overwhelming gravity of Grace's situation. He isn't just an explorer. He is humanity's Hail Mary pass. The flashback serves as a stark reminder of the stakes. If he cannot figure out how to stop the astrophage using the resources on his ship, everyone he has ever known, including his junior high students, will freeze to death. The fog of Grace's comb-induced amnesia begins to lift, allowing his natural scientific curiosity and expertise to take the wheel. He is no longer just a terrified man waking up in a room with dead bodies. He is a scientist trying to solve the puzzle of his own existence. Using the ship's optical instruments, he analyzes the local star. By measuring its luminosity, temperature, and the relative positions of surrounding stars, he reaches a startling conclusion. He is not in the solar system. He has traveled nearly 12 light-years from Earth. The star outside his window is Tau, Ceti. Grace remembers the global crisis facing Earth, an arc of light observed, stretching from the Sun to Venus, which scientists realized was actually a super-dense pathway of alien microbes. This microbe, dubbed astrophage star-eater, consumes solar energy. It uses the Sun for energy and Venus as a breeding ground, slowly dimming the Sun and threatening Earth with an impending apocalyptic ice age. When Earth's scientists looked at neighboring star systems, they realized theostrophage infection was practically universal in their local stellar neighborhood. Every nearby star was dimming except for one. Tau Ceti was completely unaffected. Understanding that he is at Tau Ceti triggers Grace's darkest realization yet, the true nature of his mission. He deduces that humanity pooled its remaining resources to build this ship, the Hail Mary. To send a crew to Tau Ceti, the objective is to figure out why this specific star system is immune to astrophage and, hopefully, find a cure to save the Sun. However, the laws of physics and the limits of their technology mean there is a horrific catch. The ship barely had gastrophage fuel to accelerate to near-light speed, make the 12-light-year journey, and decelerate. There is absolutely no fuel for a return trip. The Hail Mary was usually a symphony of predictable noises, the low thrumming bass line of the life support system, the occasional pneumatic hiss of the centrifuge adjusting, the quiet, rhythmic beep of the vital monitors. Ryland Grace had grown accustomed to the mechanical heartbeat of his isolation, until the proximity alarm screamed. It wasn't a gentle chime. It was a high-pitched klaxon wail designed to wake a crew from a deep coma jarring. Violent sound that sent a spike of pure adrenaline straight into Grace's heart. He scrambled from the lab station, floating clumsily in gravity before grabbing a handhold and launching himself toward the control room. Computer silence, alarm. He gasped, pulling himself into the pilot's seat. The shrieking stopped, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. Grace dragged his eyes to the main console. The Petrova line scanner. The array specifically calibrated to track the unique infrared light emitted by astrophagos, flashing a bright, angry yellow, proximity alert, unidentified mass detected distance, 800,000 kilometers, relative velocity, 40 kilometers per second. An asteroid, Grace muttered, his hands flying across the terminal. Has to be an asteroid. Or a rogue clump of astrophage. What else could it be? He brought up the telescopic array, desperately trying to lock onto the coordinates. The screen resolved into a field of static, then snapped into focus against the inky black backdrop of the Tau Ceti system. There, sitting dead center in Grace's hairs, was a point of light. It was radiating exactly at the Petrova frequency, 25.98 for microns. Pure, unadulterated, astrophage exhaust. Grace frowned, tapping his chin. Okay, so it's a giant ball of space. Tau Ceti is crawling with it. Makes sense? He leaned in closer, running a basic spectroscopic analysis and plotting its trajectory. He expected to see a parabolic orbit, the lazy, gravity-dictated sweep of a celestial rock or a biological spore cloud drifting through the void. Instead, the computer spat out a set of vectors that made his blood run cold. The object wasn't drifting. It was decelerating. Computer, run a diagnostic on the navigation and radar suites, Grace ordered, his voice trembling slightly. Diagnostic complete. All systems nominal. Grace stared at the numbers. He ran the calculation manually on his scratch pad, then ran it again. The physics were undeniable. The object was shedding velocity at a constant rate of 1.5 grams. Asteroids do not decelerate at a constant, mathematically perfect rate. Spore clouds do not execute controlled braking maneuvers. Nature doesn't do straight lines, and nature definitely doesn't do sustained reverse thrust. He adjusted the filters on the Petrova scope, dimming the blinding infrared glare of theostrophage exhaust to look at the mass generating it. The image was grainy, distorted by distance and radiation, but the geometry was unmistakable. It wasn't a jagged rock. It was symmetrical. It had structure. It was a ship. Panic and awe collided in Grace's chest, leaving him breathless. He was 12 light-years from Earth, the sole survivor of a desperate suicide mission to save humanity, stranded in a solar system that was entirely alien to him. He was completely, utterly, terrifyingly alone. And yet, looking at the blinking blip on the radar screen, a profoundly impossible truth settled over him. Another species had an astrophage problem, and another species had sent a ship to Tau Ceti to figure it out. The blip adjusted its heading, vectoring by a fraction of a degree. It wasn't just braking, it was turning. It was turning toward the Hail Mary. Grace gripped the edges of the console, his knuckles turning white. The crushing weight of his isolation had vanished, replaced by an infinitely more terrifying reality. He was about to make first contact. Grace realizes that his only way to communicate his findings is to load the data onto small, unmanned return probes, which he later names Beetles, and fire them back to Earth. The mission's name isn't just a nod to a desperate football play. It's a literal description of the crew's fate. He and his deceased crewmates were sent here to save humanity, fully knowing they would eventually starve to death or die of old. Age alone in the Tau Ceti system, this chapter pivots the narrative from a locked room mystery to a high-stakes survival story. Grace has to grapple with the fact that he agreed to sacrifice his life for this mission, even though his current amnesiac self doesn't quite remember making that heroic choice. It isolates him further, but it also gives him a definitive, universe-altering purpose: solve the Tau Ceti anomaly, or humanity dies. The Hail Mary shuddered, a deep, resonant groan echoing through her titanium bones. It wasn't a violent crash, but a deliberate, terrifyingly precise mechanical embrace. Clank, hiss, thud. I floated in the zero-G of the airlock corridor, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was a junior high science teacher who had somehow become humanity's last hope. And now, I was about to open my front door to an alien. The sensors on my EVA suit blared warnings. The ship that had just latched onto mine was practically a flying pressure cooker. Their hull temperature was hovering around 200 degrees Celsius, and the atmospheric pressure inside was a crushing 29 atmospheres. If I just opened the door, I wouldn't just be kill-dyed, be boiled, crushed, and vaporized in a fraction of a second. I needed a window, a very, very strong window. The alien had extended a tunnel to my airlock, a sleek, impossibly strong cylinder made of a clear, glass-like material I couldn't identify. But I couldn't trust my life entirely to alien engineering. I needed to ensure the divider between our worlds was absolutely secure on my end. Working with frantic precision, I maneuvered the ship's internal bulkhead sealant and heavy-duty transparent polymer sheets, reinforcing the seal where their tunnel met my outer airlock door. Come on, Grace. Basic physics. Force equals pressure times area. You just need the structural integrity to hold back a deep ocean. Trenches worth of pressure. My hands shook as I welded the final reinforcing brackets into place around the transparent divider. It felt less like I was building a viewing window and more like I was constructing the glass tank for a highly venomous snake. Once the structural braces were locked, I ran a microfracture diagnostic. Green lights. It would hold. Probably. I took a deep breath of recycled air, my finger hovering over the airlock cycle button. Okay, Iridian, I muttered, my voice sounding impossibly small in the comms. Let's meet. I hit the button. The heavy outer doors of the Hail Mary's airlock retracted with a mechanical whine, sliding back to reveal the transparent, pressurized divider I had just secured beyond the glass. The alien tunnel was dark, filled with a swirling, opaque atmosphere of superheated ammonia. I drifted closer to the barrier, pressing my gloved hands against the reinforced polymer. The heat radiating from the other side was immediate and intense. Fighting against the cooling systems of my EVA suit, a vibration traveled through the glass. Something was moving inside the thick, swirling fog. Thump. Thump. The rhythmic impacts were heavy, deliberate. It wasn't floating. Whatever was in there had mass, and it was walking. I swallowed hard, reaching out to flip on the high-beam exterior floodlights. Brilliant white LED light pierced the swirling ammonia gas, and there it was. It stepped out of the hazy shadows and pressed itself against the other side of the transparent divider. It was roughly the size of a large dog, but that was where any terrestrial comparison ended. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth, no distinct head. Its body was a pentagonal carapace covered in a rough, dark material that looked eerily like hardened igneous rock. Protruding from the pentagonal center were 5 limbs. They were jointed and thick, ending in multi-fingered appendages that looked strong enough to crush titanium. It moved with a disturbing, spider-like grace, shifting its weight effortlessly among its 5 legs to maintain balance for a long, suspended moment. Neither of us moved. I was staring at a creature forged in extreme heat and crushing gravity, breathing ammonia in utter darkness. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. It was an impossible creature from an impossible world. One of its 5 thick limbs slowly raised. The rock-like hand unfurled, revealing intricate digits, and pressed flat against the transparent divider, right opposite where my own trembling, gloved hand rested. I wasn't alone anymore. Before Grace can build a vocabulary, he has to understand his counterpart's biology. Rocky comes from Rid, a planet with a pitch-black, incredibly dense atmosphere. As a result, Iridians never evolved eyes. Their primary sense is a highly advanced form of echolocation, because their hearing is their sight. Their vocal communication is incredibly complex. Rocky doesn't speak in sequential syllables, like a human. He speaks in chords. He uses multiple vocal cords simultaneously to produce distinct, multitonal musical notes. A human throat is physically incapable of reproducing these sounds, and a human ear struggles to instantly parse the distinct frequencies of a fast-moving alien chord. To bridge this gap, Grace relies on off-the-shelf laboratory tech and his background as a science teacher and researcher. He builds a bespoke translation system using his ship's computer. Grace sets up a high-fidelity microphone pressed against Thagzanot dividing wall to pick up Rocky's speech, routing it into his laptop. He also sets up speakers to play sound. Back to Rocky, Grace uses a stone analysis program to run a fast Fourier transform FF. This allows the computer to take Rocky's complex, overlapping chords and break them down into their exact constituent frequencies, like isolating the individual notes in a piano chord. He creates a simple database, essentially a spreadsheet mapping. Column A is the exact frequency makeup of the alien chord. Column B is the English word it corresponds to. Column C is an audio file, a synthesized MIDI chord that perfectly mimics the alien sound. With the matrix built, Grace undertakes the painstaking process of populating the database. He relies on the one thing they universally share: physical reality. Grace holds up physical objects, or uses basic science models like the periodic table of elements, or physical models of atoms, because physics and chemistry are identical in both of their solar systems. Grace points to the object. Rocky vocalizes the Iridian chord for that object. The microphone picks up the chord, the computer analyzes the frequencies, and Grace logs it into his database. Typing the English translation, for example, hydrogen, 1 ship. To ensure the computer is getting it right, Grace types an English word on his keyboard. The computer triggers the corresponding MIDI chord through the speakers. Rocky confirms the word. The brilliance of this chapter lies in how it escalates. Grace starts with simple nouns, objects, numbers, but they rapidly have to move to verbs, adjectives, and abstract concepts like time, space, and math. They use basic math and physics constants to align their understanding of time and distance. This is also how Grace discovers Rocky uses a basics mathematical system, corresponding to his 5 limbs. Eventually, the system becomes seamless. Grace programs a script so that whenever the microphone hears a known chord, the English word immediately prints on his screen. When Grace types an English sentence, the computer instantly outputs a rapid-fire string of synthesized musical chords through the speakers. Through this acoustic matrix, Grace bypasses the physical limitations of the human vocal tract. He doesn't just learn to speak to an alien. He successfully builds a real-time bidirectional translation engine from scratch, turning a terrifyingly isolating encounter into a genuine friendship before any high-level astrophysics can be discussed. Ryland Grace and Rocky must figure out how to actually talk to each other. Grace realizes that Rocky's species, lacking eyes, uses sound and echolocation for completely perceiving their environment. Rocky speaks in complex musical chords, rather than sequential vowels and consonants. Grace sets up a rudimentary translation matrix using a microphone, his laptop, and Microsoft Excel. By pointing at objects, assigning them an English word, and having the computer record and analyze the specific frequencies of Rocky's responding chords. They painstakingly build a shared vocabulary, with a basic lexicon of nouns and numbers established. The two astronauts move to the pressing question, "Where are you from?" Lacking shared units of measurement like kilometers or light years, they rely on physical geometry. Grace constructs a makeshift physical model of our solar system using common ship supplies. Showing the sun and the planets to indicate Earth's position, Rocky reciprocates by rapidly fabricating an incredibly precise, metallic model of his own star system, utilizing his advanced engineering skills and spider-like dexterity by analyzing the relative sizes, orbital distances, and planetary masses of Rocky's physical model. Grace inputs the geometry into the Hail Mary's astronomical database. The computer finds a perfect match: 40 Eridani, a star system located roughly 16 light-years from Earth. Grace names Rocky's home planet Erid and dubs his species the Iridians. The emotional core of the chapter hits when they try to explain why they are both hovering around Tau Ceti through their crude translation system. Grace manages to explain that Earth's sun is dimming because it is infected by a which is breeding and shooting an infrared line of energy into deep space. Rocky reacts with immediate recognition. He communicates that the exact same phenomenon is killing 40 Eridani. The realization drops like a hammer. Astrophage is not an isolated local anomaly. It is an interstellar plague infecting multiple neighboring star systems. The final piece of the puzzle locks into place. Answering the biggest mystery of their encounter, both Earth and Erid noticed an anomaly in the local stellar neighborhood. While multiple stars were being infected and dimmed by astrophage, Tau Ceti remained completely immune. Both civilizations came to the exact same conclusion and executed the exact same desperate plan: build a massive interstellar ship, pack it with scientists, and send it on a one-way suicide mission to Tau Ceti to figure out what is killing the astrophage there. In hopes of sending the data back to save their home worlds, the chapter closes on a poignant note of shared tragedy. Through their exchange, they realize the devastating cost of their journeys. Grace is the sole survivor of his three-person crew. Rocky reveals that he is the sole survivor of a much larger Iridian crew, having lost his comrades to radiation exposure en route. They are two grieving, isolated individuals from entirely different evolutionary paths, now completely reliant on each other to save billions of lives. When Ryland Grace and Rocky arrive at Tau Ceti, they are looking for a needle in a cosmic haystack. Tau Ceti is the only local star whose luminosity hasn't been dimmed by astrophage, despite being exposed to it. They quickly realize that the local astrophage population is concentrated entirely between the star and one specific planet, which Grace names Adrian after one of his middle school students. Adrian is a gas giant with an incredibly hostile environment, crushing atmospheric pressure, extreme heat, and violent storms. But Catastrophe is actively breeding there. Grace deduces that Adrian must harbor an ecosystem where something is eating theostrophage faster than it can reproduce, maintaining a natural equilibrium. To prove this theory, they need an atmospheric sample from Adrian. This presents a massive logistical hurdle. The Hail Mary cannot survive atmospheric entry, and standard human probes would be crushed by the pressure and heat. This is where their unique synergy shines. Grace handles the orbital mechanics, the atmospheric physics, and the biological parameters. He designs the aerodynamic shape of the probe and calculates exactly how deep it needs to go into Adrian's atmosphere to find where the astrophage and its hypothetical Predator-Live.Rocky is a master fabricator, with access to xenonite, a miraculous iridian material that is virtually indestructible and can withstand Adrian's extreme conditions. Rocky builds a miles-long xenonite chain and a specialized pressure-resistant sampling container. Together, they execute a daring orbital maneuver, dipping the Hail Mary incredibly close to Adrian's atmosphere and dropping the xenonite probe on a fishing line to scoop up a sample of the alien air. Once they successfully winch the sample back aboard a process that nearly destroys the ship and tests their friendship, Grace analyzes the atmospheric soup under his microscope. He observes xastrophage cells zooming around, but more importantly, he spots something else, a microscopic, amoeba-like organism that is actively hunting, engulfing, and digesting the single quotes astro-phage. Grace names the organism Tamoeba, which thrives on incredible heat and radiation. Tamoeba is a relatively fragile, biology-based organism that simply evolved to use astrophage as its primary food source. The discovery of Tamoeba shifts the entire mission from a tragic fact-finding expedition to a rescue operation. If they can successfully cultivate Tamoeba on the Hail Mary, they can send it back to their respective solar systems. Tamoeba will act as an apex biological control, eating Theostrophage, infecting Sol and Forty Eridani, thereby stopping the stars from dimming, and saving both Earth and Grid from freezing to death. Grace and Rocky deduce that the only reason the Seti star system hasn't been completely dimmed by astrophagen like the suns of Earth and Eridge, that it must contain a natural predator that keeps the astrophage population in check. They trace the astrophage migration path to Adrian, a massive, incredibly hostile gas giant. To save both of their species, they must capture a sample of this unknown predator. Diving into Adrian is not a simple maneuver. The planet presents several lethal challenges. Adrian is a massive planet with a dense, violent atmosphere. If the Hail Mary goes too deep, it will be crushed or trapped by the gravity well. Unable to escape, hitting the atmosphere at orbital velocities generates immense heat. The Hail Mary was designed for interstellar travel, not for planetary atmospheric entry. The predator doesn't live at the top of the atmosphere. It lives deep inside, specifically at the altitude where astrophage breeds. They must reach exactly that depth, no more, no less, because taking the Hail Mary into the atmosphere is suicide. Grace and Rocky must literally go fishing. Relying on Rocky's genius engineering and his miraculous material, xenonite, they construct a massive, miles-long chain. At the end of this chain is a collection apparatus designed to scoop up the atmospheric gas and microbes, and seal shut. Xenonite is the only material strong enough to withstand the incredible tensile forces of being dragged through a dense atmosphere at orbital speeds without snapping. The dive requires a flawless synchronization of human orbital mechanics and Iridian engineering. Grace must calculate an elliptical orbit that skims the absolute edge of Adrian's atmosphere. It's a grazing maneuver where the ship dips just low enough for the extended chain to hit the target altitude, but high enough that the ship itself doesn't burn up or get pulled down. When the scoop hits the atmosphere, the sudden immense drag acts like a giant brake on the ship. Grace has to mathematically account for this sudden loss of velocity to ensure they have enough momentum to slingshot back out into a stable orbit. They must precisely calculate the pendulum-like swing of the chain so the scoop enters the astrophage breeding layer at the exact right moment during the orbit's period, the lowest point. During the maneuver, the tension is palpable. The Hail Mary groans under the extreme violent g-forces and the terrifying drag as the chain hits the thick atmosphere. The mission hinges entirely on their math being absolutely perfect. If the drag is higher than calculated, their orbit will decay and they will die. If the chain snaps, the mission to save Earth and Grid fails. On it, the orbit stabilizes and the winch successfully pulls the sample back aboard. When they examine the captured samples under the microscope, they find the predator. It is a single-celled organism, perfectly evolved to hunt and consume astrophage, because they found it in the Tau Ceti system, and it moves and behaves somewhat like an amoeba. Grace brilliantly and pragmatically dubs the microscopic savior Tamoeba. The crisis begins on the heels of a massive triumph. Grace and his Iridian ally, Rocky E, have successfully used forced evolution to breed a strain of Tamoeba that can survive nitrogen exposure. This is essential for their plan to deploy the microbe into the atmospheres of Venus and Threep, which are heavy in nitrogen, to consume the sun-stealing astro-phage. However, evolution is blind and highly opportunistic. In their rigorous selective breeding process, they didn't just select for nitrogen resistance. They inadvertently selected for a physical mutation that allowed the microbe to slip through the molecular structure of xenonite, the supposedly impenetrably Aryan supermaterial used for the containment tanks. The realization that something is wrong doesn't come from a loud explosion, but from terrifyingly subtle data anomalies, unexplained power drops. Grace notices a slight, then accelerating loss of ship power and heat. The ship's engines and life support run entirely on astrophage. The monitors show the raw mass of astrophage in the fuel bays is steadily dropping without being burned by the ship. The Tomoba are loose. They are inside the ship's fuel lines, treating the Hail Mary's primary energy source as an all-you-can-eat buffet. Panic is not an option. With the ship's heat dropping and the mission on the line, Grace has to use the scientific method to isolate the leak and stop the bleeding. 1. The how hypothesis. Grace first has to understand how the containment failed. He knows Thexanonaut tanks weren't broken or cracked. Through microscopic observation and testing, he deduces the terrifying truth. The nitrogen-resistant Tomoba have adapted to be able to squeeze through the microscopic lattice of Thexanonaut itself. The very material Rocky uses to build everything is now entirely porous to their engineered predator. 2. The material variable. Ife's night can't hold them. What can? Grace realizes that while Iridian material science is vastly superior in strength, human material science is different on a molecular level. He tests earthly materials and confirms a vital saving grace. Tomoba cannot pass through ordinary earth glass or steel. Their atomic structures are too dense for the microbes to squeeze through. Armed with the knowledge of how they escape and what can stop them, Grace and Rocky must enact a drastic ship-wide purge. They must immediately stop the flow of astrophage through xenonite pipes. Grace has to scramble to reroute and secure the remaining uncontaminated test rest into human-made steel and glass containers. Once the remaining fuel is secured, they have to starve out the rogue Tomoba currently in the ship's systems. This involves complex maneuvering to ensure no stray astrof is left in Theridian-built infrastructure to feed the predators. The breach costs them a devastating amount of fuel. While they save enough to survive, the margin of error for the rest of their journey is reduced to practically zero. The microscopic breach shifts the tone of the mission from proactive to profoundly vulnerable. It forces Grace to recognize that they are not just battling astrophage, but also the unpredictable nature of biology itself. The containment breach is a stark reminder that, in space, even a microscopic oversight can be entirely lethal. The problem? The nitrogen barrier. Grace and his Hyridian ally, Rocky, have finally found the solution to astrophage, infection that is dimming both of their home stars, a microscopic predator, Tomoba. However, there is a catastrophic catch. While Tomoba is perfectly safe in Earth's atmosphere, it is extremely vulnerable to nitrogen. Even trace amounts of nitrogen are instantly lethal to the microbes. Because Earth's atmosphere is mostly nitrogen, this isn't an issue for humans. We can just seed it near the sun. But Rocky's home planet, Arid, has an atmosphere heavily saturated with ammonia, which contains nitrogen. If Rocky takes the wild strain off Tomoba back to Earth, the moment it hits the atmosphere, the entire population will die, and his species will go extinct. Grace realizes he cannot genetically modify Tomoba directly. He doesn't have the equipment, the time, or the exact biological understanding of this alien microbe. Instead, he has to rely on Charles Darwin. He sets up a brutal, rapid-fire gauntlet of artificial selection to force Tomoba to evolve nitrogen resistance. Using Rocky's miraculous building material, xenonite, Grace constructs a specialized breeding apparatus. It consists of multiple interconnected microscopic chambers and valves. Places a thriving population of Tomoba into the system along with a healthy supply of astrophage, their food. 1. He introduces a minuscule, almost imperceptible amount of nitrogen gas into the chamber. 2. The introduction of the toxic gas instantly wipes out about 99.9% of Tomoba population. 3. However, due to natural genetic variation, a tiny fraction of the microbes possesses a slight natural resistance to nitrogen. These survivors live. With the competition dead, the surviving slightly nitrogen-resistant Tomoba feast on astrophage and reproduce rapidly. Once the population recovers, Grace increases the nitrogen concentration slightly and repeats the mass extinction. This is not a passive experiment. Grace is essentially playing a high-stakes game of microscopic genocide. The tension stems from the fact that if he increases the nitrogen concentration too quickly, he will achieve a 100% kill rate. Wiping out the entire culture and forcing him to start over from scratch time, they do not have. He has to carefully monitor the death rates, constantly balancing the need for rapid mutation against the risk of total extinction through grueling, continuous cycles of dosing, waiting, and reproducing. Grace successfully breeds a strain of Tomoba that can withstand an Iridian atmosphere. Andy Weir uses this sequence to set up the final devastating plot twist of the novel. By forcing Thetomoba to undergo hyperaccelerated evolution inside exonic containers, Grace inadvertently subjects them to a secondary evolutionary pressure in their desperate bid to survive the toxic nitrogen. The Tomoba don't just evolve to tolerate the gas, they evolve a mechanism to hide from it. They mutate to become capable of slipping through the molecular structure of selenite itself. This sets the stage for the climax of the book. Long after the experiment is successfully concluded, the new Ultra-Volva-Tomoba breach the Xenonet fuel tanks on the Hail Mary, devouring the ship's astrophage fuel and leaving Grace stranded, leading to his ultimate sacrifice to save Rocky. The air aboard the Hail Mary was thick with a bittersweet tension. The nitrogen-resistant Taumibath, the microscopic heroes bred to devour the astrophage, eating their stars, were securely contained in their respective breeding tanks. Grace meticulously loaded the precious cargo and the culmination of their scientific data into the 4 miniature return probes, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Across the Xenonet, Rocky was a flurry of synchronized limbs, making the final repairs to the Blippa. The Iridian ship, scarred but resilient, was finally ready to make the long journey back to the Forti Eridani system. They had done the math a dozen times over. The fuel was calculated, the trajectories plotted, and the life-saving payload was secure. Earth Android finally had a fighting chance. Taumiba, status, stable, reproducing, and confirmed nitrogen-resistant. Beetles probes. Data drives, loaded. Astrophage fuel tanks topped off, targeting systems locked on Sol. Ship integrity, hull breaches patched. Propulsion systems primed. Severing the umbilical cord, the physical separation of the ships, was a mechanical necessity, but it carried a heavy psychological weight. For months, the makeshift Sinonite tunnel connecting the Hail Mary to the Blippa had been a bridge between two worlds, transforming to desperate, lonely survivors into a seamless, interstellar team. Grace detached the tunnel seals with a heavy heart. The loud metallic clanks echoed through the hull, finalizing the physical divide. They were no longer a single unified station. They were once again 2 isolated lifeboats floating in the dark. "You are good friend, Grace. Save Earth. Ice Brid." Rocky's voice chimed through the translation software. A complex melody, Ophiridian chords rendered into synthesized staccato English. The simplicity of the words barely contained the immense gratitude behind them. Grace stared at the screen, looking at the thermal representation of his spider-like companion. It hit him all at once. He was saying goodbye to the best friend he had ever had, a being from another star whom he would never see again. They had shared their cultures, their sciences, and their fears. They had saved each other's lives more times than Grace could count. "You're a good friend too, Rocky," Grace said, his voice cracking. He pressed his hand against the cold glass of the divider, a desperate, final gesture of connection. On the other side, Rocky mirrored the movement, pressing one of his hot, heavy, rock-like hands against the exit. The thermal camera flared bright red where they touched. "Sad, sad, sad," Rocky chimed, the Iridian equivalent of shedding tears. The rapid minor keynotes conveyed an ache that transcended species. "Yeah, buddy. Very sad," Grace replied, forcing a smile that Rocky couldn't see, but would hopefully understand through the tone of his voice. "But also, a maze. What we did was a maze. A maze. A maze." Rocky agreed, his chords shifting into a brighter, triumphant sequence. With the final diagnostics complete, there was nothing left to do but execute the launch sequence. Grace backed away from the monitor and strapped himself into the command chair of the Hail Mary. Through the exterior cameras, Grace watched the Blippa detach. The massive utilitarian vessel drifted away silently against the backdrop of the cosmos. A brilliant flash of light erupted from the Blippa's engines as Rocky ignited his spin drives, the sheer force of the acceleration rapidly shrinking the ship into a distant, glowing speck and then into nothingness. Grace was alone again. The silence of the Hail Mary was suddenly deafening. But as he turned his attention to the terminal controlling the beetles, the heavy sorrow in his chest was matched by a profound sense of purpose. They had done the impossible. Now, it was time to send hope back home. This is one of the most emotionally devastating and defining moments in Andy Weir's Project Hail Mary. It represents the absolute climax of Ryland Grace's character arc, transforming him from a man who was forced into a suicide mission against his will into a hero who makes a conscious choice to sacrifice himself for another. To fully appreciate the weight of this chapter, we have to look at how the science, the stakes, and the emotional bonds perfectly collide. Here is an expansion of that agonizing turning point. First, to gently clarify the science of the situation, the Tomoba don't actually eat the ship's materials. Instead, the crisis is born from a microscopic oversight regarding shenanite, the miracle material Rocky uses to build almost everything, while experimenting to make the Tomoba resistant to nitrogen so they can survive in Venus's atmosphere and save Earth. Grace forces them to adapt to increasingly harsh conditions. What he doesn't realize, until it's almost too late, is that syenite is essentially a complex polymer with a microscopic molecular lattice. By selectively breeding Thetomoba to survive the nitrogen, he inadvertently bred a variant capable of squishing itself down small enough to slip through the molecular gaps in Thexanotinate. The horror dawns on Grace when he checks his Auncexonite sample boxes on the Hail Mary and realizes that Taumoeba have bypassed the barrier and consumed the astrophage inside. The emotional gut punch comes from the immediate mathematical deduction. Grace knows exactly how Rocky's ship, the Blip, is constructed. Rocky's fuel tanks are made off selenite. Rocky's engines are powered by astrophage. Rocky took millions of these new Mutatomoeba aboard his ship to save his home planet. Grace realizes that within a matter of weeks, the Tomoba will breach the Blip's fuel tanks. They will consume all of Rocky's astro. Rocky's ship will suffer a total power failure in the middle of interstellar space. Without power, the ship's internal heaters will fail, and Rocky, who requires an environment of over 200 degrees Celsius to survive, will slowly freeze to death in the dark. Furthermore, Arid will be doomed. The brilliance of this setup is that Grace does not have to choose between saving Earth and saving Rocky. He has the Beatles, the 4 unmanned miniature delivery ships, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. He can load them with the nitrogen-resistant Tomoba and fire them back to Earth. Humanity will survive. The choice is entirely about Grace's own survival. He has just enough camouflage food to make it back to Earth, where he would be celebrated as the greatest savior in human history. If he turns the Hail Mary around to catch up with the Blippa, he will expend the rest of his fuel and food. He will likely die of starvation, Onarad, assuming he even survives the rescue. This is the moment the coward truly dies. Earlier in the story, we learn the dark truth about Grace. He wasn't a willing volunteer. Strat had to drug him and force him onto the ship because he was terrified to die. All he has wanted since waking up with amnesia is to survive and go home. But his bond with Rocky has fundamentally changed him. Thirdian saved his life, kept him sane, and shared everything he had to ensure both their species could survive. When Grace looks at the cold calculus of the universe, he simply cannot stomach the idea of his friend dying alone in the freezing void. He meticulously loads the Beetles, secures the data and Thetomoba samples, and launches them toward Earth, trusting humanity to figure out the rest. Then, with a mixture of terror and profound love, he manually alters the trajectory of the Hail Mary. He abandons his trip home, dedicating his remaining resources and his life to finding a needle in a cosmic haystack to save his friend. The heavy pull of Arid's gravity was a constant, aching reminder of how far Ryland Grace was from home. But the specialized exoskeleton the Iridian engineers had built for him made the walk to the observatory manageable. Inside his transparent Earth climate dome, the air was a comfortable 72 degrees, smelling faintly of the synthetic proteins that made up his breakfast. Outside the dome, the world was pitch black, a sweltering ammonia-rich furnace that would boil a human alive in seconds. But to Grace, it was simply home. Teacher Grace. Teacher Grace? Question. The harmonic, multitonal chords resonated through the specialized translation software piped into his earpiece. A cluster of young Ridians, small rocky pentagons, scuttling on their articulated limbs, pressed against the reinforced glass of his habitat. "I hear you." "Kids," Grace said, his voice raspy with age but warm. He tapped the external speaker button. "Class doesn't start for another hour. Go practice your thermal dynamics." "Acknowledge." "Happy, happy." They chimed in unison, their carapaces clicking as they scrambled away into the dark. Grace smiled, leaning heavily on his workstation. He was a long way from the junior high classrooms of Earth. But the universal truth of teaching remained. Kids were always eager, always curious, and always a handful. Today, however, Grace's mind wasn't on his lesson plans. Today was the culmination of a 16-year wait. The star system Forty Eridani was exactly 16.3 light years away from Earth. That meant the light leaving Earth's sun, Sol, took just over 16 years to cross the void and reach Theridian orbital telescopes. If the Hail Mary's Beetles had successfully delivered Thetomoba payload to Earth, and if humanity had managed to seed Venus and breed theostrophigating microbes, the results would only just now be visible. From Ryland Grace settled into his reinforced chair and brought up the telemetry feeds on his monitor. The Iridians, despite being entirely blind, had built magnificent optical telescopes in orbit, entirely at Grace's request. The data was translated into graphs and numerical outputs that he could read. He pulled up the target, Sol, Yellow Dwarf, Sector 4, his hands. Speckled with age and trembling slightly from the strain of his daily life, hovered over the keyboard. He initiated the spectral analysis. The screen blinked. Columns of data began to populate. Grace ignored the complex telemetry and looked for the only metric that mattered. Right now, total solar irradiance. Before he left Earth, astrophage had been dimming the sun at an exponential rate, threatening to plunge humanity into an ice age that would extinguish all life. The baseline luminosity of Sol had been dropping. Grace held his breath. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 100%. Analysis complete. He stared at the numbers pre-infection baseline. 1361 W square meters peak. Infection estimated E10 lambai arsha siv wame pinfami. Catastrophic global cooling. Current reading 1361 W square meters. Grace blinked. He took off his glasses, wiped them on his shirt, and put them back on. He looked at the data again. Thepatruva lined the infrared. Trail, ophistrophage migrating between Venus and Earth was gone. The sun's luminosity was perfectly, beautifully normal. A universe of relief sound escaped Grace's throat. He slumped back in his chair, the tension of decades finally evaporating from his shoulders. They had done it. His students, back on Earth, the brilliant minds left behind, they had caught the beetles, bred Thetomoba, and saved the world. Earth was warm. Earth was alive. Somewhere across the unimaginably vast dark, humanity was going on. People were drinking coffee, complaining about the weather, and looking up at a bright yellow sun. His students, who would be fully grown adults by now, perhaps with children of their own, had survived. A soft, rhythmic tapping came from the airlock intercom. It was Rocky Theridian engineer's chords filtered through the speaker, low and inquiring. "Friend Grace, you are leaking water from eyes. Sad?" Grace reached up and wiped the tears from his cheeks. He looked at his best friend, the alien who had saved his life, and whose world he had helped save in return. "Rocky," Grace said, his voice thick with emotion, a wide smile breaking across his weathered face. "Not sad, happy, happy, happy." "Why happy?" Rocky asked, his carapace shifting in curiosity. Grace tapped the glass of the monitor, pointing at the data that Rocky couldn't physically see but would perfectly understand. "Earth," Grace said simply. "Earth is saved." There was a long pause from the intercom. Then, a series of rapid, triumphant chords burst through the speaker. Echoing Rocky's immense joy, Grace turned away from the monitor and looked out into the pitch black, a sweltering, utterly alien world that had taken him in. He had lost Earth, but he had given it a future. And here, surrounded by eager students and his greatest friend, Ryland Grace finally knew peace. His mission was complete.